"Don't touch anything you don't understand," Edward Whitmore said, his voice cutting clean through the polished glass boardroom as if it had edges, and for a second, every movement in the room slowed, pens hovering, screens glowing, 12 executives seated around a 30-foot marble table turning their heads just slightly toward the woman standing near the wall, Naomi Carter, her hand still lifted halfway toward the contract she had been refilling water beside, her fingers trembling just enough to notice if anyone had been looking closely, but no one really was, not at her, not beyond the uniform, the name tag, the quiet assumption that she existed only to pass through unnoticed, and so the moment stretched, thin and fragile, before she slowly lowered her hand, nodding once as if agreeing with a rule she had already known long before he said it, long before she stepped into rooms like this one. Rooms where voices like hers never carried weight, where silence was safer than being wrong out loud, even when you knew you weren't wrong at all, and the faint sound of a suppressed chuckle from somewhere down the table sealed it, small, careless, but sharp enough, and Naomi turned without another word, her shoes making almost no sound against the marble floor as she walked toward the door, shoulders steady, chin level, every step controlled, measured, like she had practiced leaving without being seen. Like disappearing was a skill she had perfected over time, and behind her, the meeting resumed almost instantly, voices layering back over each other, percentages, projections, confidence filling the space again as if nothing had interrupted it, as if she had never raised her hand, never almost spoken, never almost shifted the direction of something much larger than herself, and Edward leaned back slightly in his chair, pen resting between his fingers, eyes scanning the contract in front of him with the calm certainty of someone who had signed deals worth more than most people would see in a lifetime, the room reflecting off the surface of the table, light catching the sharp lines of his suit, everything controlled, everything in place, until his pen hovered just still there in her mind, the clause still unfolding in perfect clarity, line by line, consequence by consequence, a chain reaction she could already see reaching months into the future, lawsuits, losses, reputations collapsing under something that could have been stopped with a single sentence spoken at the right moment, and she pressed her lips together slightly, not in regret, but in recognition of the pattern she knew too well. Speak and be dismissed, or stay silent and remain invisible, and today she had chosen silence, not because she did not understand, but because she understood exactly how the room worked, exactly who was allowed to be right, and who was expected to stay quiet, and the elevator chimed softly as it passed the 20th floor, then the 15th, each number lighting up briefly before fading, like moments she had already lived through before, different buildings, different rooms, same outcome. And she adjusted the cuff of her sleeve with a small, precise motion, grounding herself in something physical, something simple, as the doors finally opened into the wide lobby below, sunlight spilling through the floor-to-ceiling windows in long golden lines that stretched across the polished stone floor, and she stepped out into it without hesitation, the warmth brushing against her face for just a second before she moved forward, pushing her cart toward the service corridor, her pace even, unhurried, as if nothing had happened upstairs, as if there had been no moment at all, but inside the boardroom, something had begun to unravel in a way no one could yet fully see, Edward Whitmore's pen still hovering above the page, unmoving now, his eyes locked on a paragraph he had already read twice, then 3 times, the words no longer sliding past with ease, but catching, resisting, demanding attention in a way that felt unfamiliar, uncomfortable, and the voices around him continued, projections, timelines, confident assurances layered over one another, but they sounded distant now, muted, as if coming from another room entirely, and his jaw tightened just slightly as he leaned forward, bringing the document closer, his finger tracing a line of text. Slowly, deliberately, until it stopped, and stayed there, and the silence that followed was not immediate, not obvious, but it was growing, spreading outward from him like a ripple, subtle at first, then sharper, as one executive paused mid-sentence, noticing the change, then another, until the rhythm of the room began to falter, uncertainty slipping in where certainty had been just seconds before, and Edward exhaled once, low and controlled, before speaking, not loudly, but with enough weight to stop everything completely. "Read this again," he said, sliding the contract slightly across the table, his tone no longer dismissive, no longer certain, and across the room, eyes dropped to the page, scanning quickly, then slower, then stopping in the same place he had, the same line, the same hidden shift, and something like realization flickered across more than one face, subtle but undeniable, while downstairs Naomi reached the service hallway, turning the corner where the bright light of the lobby faded into softer, dimmer tones, the familiar quiet of a place not meant to be seen, and she parked her cart neatly against the wall, her fingers resting on the handle for a moment longer than necessary, her gaze drifting briefly toward the exit sign at the end of the corridor, glowing steady and green, a simple direction forward, uncomplicated, and she took a small breath, steady and even, as if preparing to leave the entire moment behind her, unaware that above her, the truth she had chosen not to speak was already finding its way to the surface, piece by piece, without her, but not without consequence. The air in the boardroom had changed, not loudly, not all at once, but in a way that settled into the space like something heavy and undeniable, the kind of silence that did not come from authority, but from uncertainty, and Edward Whitmore remained still at the head of the table, his eyes fixed on the same line as if it might rearrange itself if he looked long enough, but it did not, it stayed exactly where it was, clear now in a way it had not been before, and across from him, one of the senior analysts leaned forward, adjusting his glasses as he reread the clause. Slower this time, his confidence thinning with each word, while another executive shifted in her seat, her fingers tapping lightly against the edge of her tablet before stopping altogether, the rhythm gone, replaced by something closer to hesitation, and Edward finally leaned back slightly, his jaw set, not in anger, but in realization, the kind that comes too late to feel comfortable. "How did we miss this?" he said quietly, not directing the question at anyone in particular, because the answer was already forming in his mind, hidden in a moment he had dismissed just minutes earlier, a raised hand, a quiet interruption, a voice he had cut off before it even had the chance to speak, and the memory landed with a weight that did not show on his face, but changed something behind his eyes, and he looked up, scanning the room once, not for the contract now, but for something else, someone else, but the space near the wall was empty, the cart gone, the presence erased as completely as if it had never been there, and downstairs, Naomi Carter moved through the service corridor with the same steady pace, turning into the staff locker area where the light was softer, the air cooler, the hum of machines replacing the distant echo of conversation she was never meant to be part of, and she placed her cleaning cloth carefully into a bin, folding it once before letting it go, a small, deliberate action that marked the end of something she had already decided to leave behind, and she reached for her bag, resting on the narrow bench beside her locker, her fingers brushing against the worn strap, familiar, grounding, as she paused just briefly, her gaze drifting upward to the small rectangular mirror mounted on the wall, catching her reflection again, not the one shaped by the boardroom, but her own, unfiltered, steady, and she held it there for a second longer, not questioning herself, not doubting what she knew, but acknowledging the quiet cost of not being heard, and back upstairs, Edward's chair scraped lightly against the floor as he stood, the sound cutting through the stillness sharper than any raised voice could have, drawing every eye toward him as he moved around the table, not rushed, but with a purpose that had not been there before, and one of the executives cleared his throat slightly, attempting to regain control of the meeting, but Edward did not respond, did not sit back down. Instead he stopped near the end of the table, his hand resting against the cool surface as he looked toward the door, the same door Naomi had walked through just moments earlier, and the image replayed in his mind with uncomfortable clarity, her hand raised, his voice cutting her off, the faint sound of laughter, and something in that sequence no longer sat right, not when placed next to the line in front of him, not when the consequence of that silence was now staring back at him in plain text, and he exhaled once, slower this time, before turning his head slightly toward his assistant, his voice lower, but carrying across the room with unmistakable intent. Who was she, he asked, not as a dismissal, but as a question that demanded an answer, and the assistant hesitated, caught off guard by the shift, glancing briefly toward the door as if the answer might still be standing there, but it was not, and downstairs, Naomi slipped her bag over her shoulder, the strap settling into place as she turned toward the hallway that led to the exit, the green sign glowing steadily at the far end, unchanged, offering the same simple direction forward, and she began to walk toward it, unaware that the moment she had already left behind was now reaching for her again. Not with dismissal this time, but with something very different, something that had just begun to take shape above her. The hallway felt longer than it had a few minutes ago, the distance between Naomi Carter and the exit stretching just enough to be noticed as her footsteps echoed softly against the walls, steady but not rushed, her hand brushing lightly against the strap of her bag as if confirming it was still there, still real, still hers, and the green exit sign ahead glowed with the same quiet certainty it always had, unchanged by anything that had happened upstairs, offering a simple path forward without questions, without judgment, and she kept moving toward it, her breathing even, her posture composed, but beneath that calm was a quiet finality, the kind that comes when a decision has already been made and there is nothing left to revisit, nothing left to prove. And back in the boardroom, Edward Whitmore stood near the edge of the table, his presence no longer just commanding, but unsettled in a way that shifted the energy of the entire room, his question still hanging in the air, unanswered. Who was she? And the assistant finally straightened, flipping quickly through a tablet, fingers moving faster now, urgency replacing routine. She is with facilities, temporary staff, Naomi Carter, he said, the name landing in the room with a weight that felt disproportionate to its simplicity, and Edward repeated it once under his breath, not loudly, but enough to fix it in place, as if saying it made the moment more real, more accountable, and he turned toward the door without another word. The movement immediate now, decisive, his earlier hesitation replaced by something sharper, something that did not allow delay, and one of the executives shifted forward in his seat, confused. Edward, we still need to finalize, but the sentence did not finish, because Edward was already moving, already stepping out into the hallway, the door closing behind him with a quiet firmness that cut off the rest of the room, leaving them in a silence that felt very different from before, and he walked down the corridor with a pace that was controlled but unmistakably faster than before, his shoes striking the floor with a rhythm that carried intent, not anger, not panic, but urgency shaped by realization, and as he reached the elevator bank, he pressed the call button once, then again, the small delay of seconds stretching longer than it should have, and for the first time in a long time, waiting felt unfamiliar to him, uncomfortable, because he was not used to being late to something that mattered. And downstairs, Naomi reached the end of the corridor, her hand extending toward the metal push bar of the exit door, her fingers hovering there for just a fraction of a second, not out of doubt, but out of awareness that this was the final step, the moment where the building, the meeting, the silence, all of it would fall behind her completely, and she pressed forward gently, the door opening with a soft release as a rush of late afternoon air met her face, warmer, brighter, carrying the distant sound of the city beyond, cars passing, voices blending into a low hum of life that existed entirely separate from what had just happened inside, and she stepped through, one foot, then the other, the light shifting across her as she moved, her shadow stretching briefly across the concrete before settling into place beside her, and she let the door close behind her without looking back, the click soft but final, sealing the space she had just left, and at that same moment, the elevator doors upstairs opened with a quiet chime, Edward stepping inside immediately, his reflection appearing in the mirrored walls, sharper now, more focused, his gaze fixed ahead as the doors slid shut, and as the elevator began its descent, he did not move, did not speak. His mind replaying the same sequence again and again, her hand raised, his voice cutting her off, the line in the contract, the realization, the cost, and somewhere within that loop, something else had taken hold, something he could not ignore anymore, not after seeing what he had missed, not after knowing who had seen it first, and as the numbers ticked downward above the door, each floor passing in steady intervals, the distance between them shrinking second by second, he exhaled once, slower. This time, as if preparing not just to find her, but to face something far less familiar than any deal he had ever signed, and outside, Naomi adjusted the strap on her shoulder and began walking toward the street, her steps steady, her direction clear, unaware that behind her, the moment she had already closed the door on was now moving toward her with a speed and certainty she had not expected. The city air carried a low, constant hum as Naomi Carter stepped onto the sidewalk, the glass doors of the building closing behind her with a soft, final click that seemed to fade almost instantly into the noise of passing traffic and distant voices, and she paused for just a moment, not turning back, not hesitating, but allowing the shift in atmosphere to settle over her, the warmth of the late afternoon sun brushing against her skin, the faint breeze moving past her shoulders, everything outside feeling open, uncontained, unlike the controlled silence she had just left behind, and she adjusted the strap of her bag again, a small, grounding motion, before beginning to walk, her pace steady, her direction clear, each step carrying her farther from the building that had never truly seen her, and inside, the elevator doors opened with a quiet chime as Edward Whitmore stepped out into the lobby, his eyes scanning the space immediately, sharp, focused, the calm precision he was known for now driven by something more urgent, something less practiced, and the polished floor reflected his movement as he crossed it quickly, passing by the reception desk without slowing, his gaze already shifting toward the main entrance, calculating distance, time, possibility, and one of the security staff. Straightened slightly as he passed, sensing the change in his presence without understanding it, while outside, Naomi reached the edge of the curb, the crosswalk light blinking down its final seconds, and she stopped, waiting, her posture relaxed but attentive, her eyes fixed forward as cars moved steadily across the intersection, engines low and constant, and she exhaled slowly, a quiet release that carried more than just breath. A release of the moment upstairs, of the decision she had made. Of the choice to remain silent in a room that had not asked to hear her, and she did not replay it, did not question it, because she already knew the outcome would have been the same, and behind her, the glass doors of the building opened again, faster this time, the motion more forceful than before, and Edward stepped out onto the sidewalk, the light catching his features differently now, less controlled, more exposed, his eyes scanning the street with a focus that cut through the movement of people and cars, searching, narrowing, adjusting, and for a second, he did not see her, just the flow of the city, the ordinary motion of people going about their day, but then his gaze shifted slightly to the left, catching a familiar shape, the line of her shoulders, the way she stood just apart from the crowd, still, composed, and something in him locked onto that image with certainty, and the crosswalk signal changed, the light turning white, the steady flow of traffic slowing, stopping, and Naomi stepped forward with the others, moving into the street at a calm, even pace, unaware of the eyes that had finally found her, and Edward moved forward as well, not running, not calling out yet, but closing the distance step by step, his focus unwavering now, every movement aligned with a single intention, and as Naomi reached the halfway point of the crosswalk, the sound of footsteps behind her grew just slightly more distinct, closer, more deliberate than the rest, and she sensed it, not as a threat, but as a presence that did not match the rhythm of the crowd, and her pace slowed just a fraction, almost unnoticeable, her awareness sharpening without turning her head, and Edward was only a few steps behind now, the space between them narrowing to something that could no longer be ignored, his voice rising just enough to carry over the ambient noise, steady but different from before, no longer dismissive, no longer distant. Naomi, he called, the name clear, direct, and for the first time, it was not said as an afterthought, not as a label, but as recognition, and Naomi stopped mid-step, the motion small but decisive, her shoulders still, her breath pausing for just a second as the sound of her name reached her fully, settling into the moment with a weight she had not expected, and slowly, without urgency, without fear, she turned. Naomi Carter turned slowly, not startled, not rushed, just enough to face the voice that had called her name with a clarity that did not belong to the moment she had left behind, and the noise of the city seemed to shift around them, not disappearing, but softening just enough to create a space between them, a pause suspended in motion as people continued to pass on either side, unaware of the weight carried in that single moment. And Edward Whitmore stood a few steps away, his breath slightly uneven, not from distance, but from the unfamiliarity of what he was about to do, his posture still composed, but no longer distant, no longer shielded by the certainty he had carried upstairs, and for a second, neither of them spoke, the silence not empty, but full, layered with everything that had not been said before, everything that had been dismissed too quickly, and Naomi's expression remained calm, her eyes steady on him, not defensive, not welcoming, simply present, as if she were waiting for him to decide what kind of voice he would use this time, and Edward exhaled slowly, the tension in his jaw easing just enough to let something more honest come through. "You saw something," he said, not as an accusation, not as a challenge, but as a statement he had already accepted, and Naomi held his gaze for a brief moment before answering, her voice even, measured, yes, and nothing more, no explanation offered, no urgency to justify herself, just the truth placed simply between them, and Edward nodded once, the motion small, but deliberate, as if acknowledging not only her answer but the weight behind it, and he stepped slightly closer, closing the distance without crowding her, careful now in a way he had not been before. "Why did you not say it?" he asked, the question quieter than his first, less certain, and Naomi's eyes shifted for just a second, not away from him, but inward, toward the moment she had already lived through, the raised hand, the interruption, the laughter, and when she spoke again, her voice carried no resentment, no edge, only clarity. "I tried," she said, and the simplicity of it landed heavier than anything more elaborate could have, and Edward's gaze dropped briefly, not in defeat, but in recognition, the memory aligning perfectly now with the reality in front of him, and he nodded again, slower this time, as if accepting something he could not undo, something that had already shaped the outcome of the moment. And the light shifted slightly as a cloud passed overhead, softening the brightness around them, and for a brief second, everything felt quieter, more contained, and Edward looked back up at her, his voice steady, but changed, stripped of the authority that had filled it before. "Can you show me?" he said, and the words were not a command, not an expectation, but a request, clear and direct, and Naomi did not answer immediately, her expression unchanged, her posture still composed, but something in the air between them had shifted again, not back to what it had been, but forward into something uncertain, something untested, and she studied him for a moment longer, not measuring his status, not reacting to his position, but assessing something far more subtle, the intention behind his words, the difference in his tone, the space he was now allowing where there had been none before, and the city continued to move around them, cars passing, signals changing, people crossing without noticing, but within that motion, the stillness between them held, quiet and deliberate, as Naomi finally drew a slow breath, her fingers adjusting slightly against the strap of her bag, grounding herself once more before she spoke, not quickly, not impulsively, but with the same steady control she had carried through every moment so far. "I can," she said, and then paused, just long enough to make the next words matter, her voice soft, but unmistakably firm, "but I am not walking back into that room the same way." Edward Whitmore did not respond immediately, and that silence said more than any quick agreement could have, because for the first time in a long time, he was not negotiating terms, not setting conditions, not controlling the direction of the moment, he was listening, and Naomi Carter stood across from him, steady, unshaken, her words still hanging in the air with quiet authority, not loud, not forceful, but impossible to ignore, and the city moved around them without pause, a car passing slowly behind her, the faint sound of a horn somewhere in the distance, footsteps crossing the street, all of it continuing as if nothing significant was happening, but between them, everything had shifted, and Edward nodded once, not as a reflex, but as a decision. "You will not," he said, his voice calm, but different now, stripped of the edge it had carried before, and he gestured lightly back toward the building, not as a command, but as an invitation. "Then we do it differently," and Naomi's eyes remained on him, studying not the words, but the way they were delivered, the space he allowed after them, the absence of dismissal, and she did not move yet, not until she was certain the moment was real, and inside the building, the boardroom had not recovered its rhythm, the conversation reduced to low, uncertain exchanges. Executives leaning toward one another in quiet discussion, the earlier confidence replaced by careful re-examination, documents spread across the table again, but this time without the same certainty, and one of the senior partners tapped the page where the clause sat, his finger lingering there as if the paper itself might explain how it had been overlooked, and the assistant stood near the doorway, glancing toward the hall every few seconds, waiting, unsure of what would happen next, and outside, Edward stepped slightly to the side, giving Naomi a clear path, a small gesture, but one that changed the dynamic entirely, and she noticed it, not as a courtesy, but as recognition, and after a brief pause, she turned back toward the building, not with hesitation, but with intention, her steps measured, deliberate, each one carrying a different weight than before, not the quiet exit of someone leaving unnoticed, but the return of someone who had already proven something without needing permission, and Edward followed a step behind, not leading, not directing, just present, and as they reached the glass doors, he moved ahead just enough to hold one open, the motion smooth, unspoken, and Naomi walked through without breaking stride, the cool air of the lobby meeting her again, but this time it felt different, not because the space had changed, but because her place within it had, and the receptionist looked up briefly, recognition flickering across her face as she noticed Naomi returning alongside Edward, the pairing unexpected, the shift subtle but visible, and they crossed the lobby together, the polished floor reflecting their movement in parallel lines, and as they approached the elevator, the doors opened almost instantly, as if anticipating their arrival, and Naomi stepped inside. First, turning to face forward, her posture unchanged, her expression calm, and Edward stepped in beside her, the doors closing with a soft finality that sealed them into a space where the next moment would be decided, and as the elevator began to rise, the numbers lighting one by one above the door, the silence between them returned, but it was no longer uncertain, no longer heavy with what had been dismissed, it was focused, deliberate. And Naomi's eye shifted briefly to the reflection in the mirrored wall, catching a glimpse of both of them standing there, side by side, no longer separated by distance or assumption. And when the elevator slowed, approaching the floor they had just left behind, she exhaled once, steady and controlled, ready not to repeat the moment, but to redefine it. And as the doors began to open, the light from the hallway spilling in, the room beyond waiting, unchanged on the surface, but no longer the same in what it was about to face. The elevator doors opened fully, and Naomi Carter stepped out first, her pace neither hurried nor hesitant, each step grounded with a quiet certainty that did not ask for permission, while Edward Whitmore followed just behind, not overtaking her, not directing her, simply present in a way that the hallway seemed to recognize, the soft overhead lights reflecting along the polished floor as they moved toward the boardroom door that stood slightly ajar. Voices inside low but tense, the rhythm of uncertainty still lingering, and as Naomi reached the doorway, she paused for just a fraction of a second, not from doubt, but from awareness, the memory of how she had left still fresh, still clear, and then she stepped forward, crossing the threshold again, but not as the same person who had walked out, and the room shifted immediately, conversations cutting off mid-sentence, heads turning in near unison, eyes landing on her first, then on Edward behind her, and the silence that followed was complete, heavier than before, because this time it was not confusion, it was recognition. And Edward did not move to the head of the table right away, did not reclaim the position that had once defined the space. Instead he remained slightly to the side, his voice steady but carrying a different weight. "She is going to walk us through it," he said, and the phrasing alone changed everything, not an introduction, not an explanation, but a transfer of focus, and Naomi felt it, the shift in the room, the attention no longer dismissive, no longer filtered through assumption, but direct, expectant, and she moved forward. Not quickly, not slowly, just enough to reach the edge of the table where the contract still lay open, the same page visible, the same clause waiting, and she placed her hand lightly against the surface, not claiming it, but anchoring herself in the moment, her eye scanning the document once, confirming what she already knew, and when she spoke, her voice was calm, clear, carrying across the room without strain. "This clause," she began, her finger tracing the line with quiet precision, "it shifts full liability after execution, not proportionally, not conditionally, but entirely," and the words landed one by one, not rushed, not softened, each one structured with the kind of clarity that did not leave space for dismissal, and she continued, explaining the structure, the phrasing, the intentional ambiguity that masked the outcome, her tone steady, her pace controlled, and across the table, the executives leaned in slightly, not interrupting, not questioning, but listening, truly listening now, and Edward watched from where he stood, his expression composed, but his attention fixed entirely on her, not the document, not the deal, but the person who had seen what he had not, and as Naomi finished outlining the consequence, she lifted her gaze from the page, meeting the room directly, not seeking approval, not waiting for validation, just stating what was already true, and the silence that followed was different again, not heavy with tension, but filled with understanding. The kind that settles in when something undeniable has been made clear, and one of the senior partners slowly leaned back, exhaling as he processed the implications, while another closed his folder halfway, the earlier certainty gone completely, replaced by a careful recalibration, and Edward finally stepped forward then, not to take over, but to stand beside her, his presence no longer overshadowing, but aligning, and he nodded once, his voice measured, but firm. "Remove it," he said, directing the room, but not interrupting her space, and the team moved immediately, notes being taken, adjustments being made, the momentum shifting under her words, not his, and Naomi stepped back slightly, her hand leaving the table, her posture unchanged, her expression calm, as if the moment had always belonged to the truth itself, not to who delivered it, and for a brief second, her eyes flickered toward Edward, not for acknowledgement, but to confirm something quieter, something more important, and he met her gaze with a nod that carried no authority, no expectation, only recognition, and in that silent exchange, something settled between them, not resolved, not finished, but understood, and as the room began to move again, reorganizing around the correction, Naomi stood still for just a moment longer, aware that she had returned, spoken, and changed something without raising her voice, without forcing her presence, and yet the story of how that moment would continue, what it would mean beyond this room, had only just begun. The room did not return to what it had been, even as voices resumed and papers shifted across the table, because something quieter had taken its place, something that did not need to announce itself, and Naomi Carter stood just a step back from the table, her hands resting lightly at her sides, her breathing even, her presence steady in a way that did not demand attention, yet held it without effort, and around her, the executives moved with a different kind of focus now, not rushed, not careless, but deliberate, reviewing each line with care they had not given it before, and Edward Whitmore remained beside her, not reclaiming the head of the table, not stepping ahead, simply observing the shift he had not created but now understood, his gaze moving from the document to Naomi and back again, as if recalibrating something deeper than the deal itself, and after a moment, he turned slightly toward her, his voice low enough that it did not interrupt the room, but clear enough that it did not hide. "You were right," he said, not as praise, not as obligation, but as fact, and Naomi met his gaze briefly, her expression unchanged, not seeking the acknowledgement, not rejecting it either, just accepting it as something that had arrived later than it should have, but arrived nonetheless, and she gave a small nod, the motion minimal, almost imperceptible, before her attention shifted back to the room, not because she needed to stay, but because she understood the moment was still unfolding, and across the table, one of the senior partners closed his folder fully this time, leaning back as he exhaled slowly, the tension easing from his shoulders, while another adjusted his tie, glancing once toward Naomi with a look that was no longer dismissive, but measured, reconsidering, and the assistant near the door stood straighter now, no longer uncertain, but attentive in a different way, as if the hierarchy of the room had subtly realigned. Without anyone announcing it, and the light from the windows shifted again, the late afternoon sun lowering just enough to cast longer reflections across the table, stretching the lines of the room into something softer, less rigid, and Naomi took a small step back, creating space between herself and the table, her role in this moment complete, not because she had been told so, but because she knew it, and Edward noticed the movement, his eyes following her just slightly as she turned toward the door, not abruptly, not dramatically, just with quiet intention, and for a second, it seemed as though he might say something more, might ask her to stay, to step further into the space she had just changed, but he did not, because something in him understood that what she had done did not require extension, did not require ownership, and instead, he stepped aside, just enough to clear her path again, the same gesture as before, but now fully understood, and Naomi walked toward the door. With the same steady pace she had carried from the beginning, her steps soft against the floor, her shoulders relaxed, her gaze forward, and as she reached the threshold, she paused for the briefest moment, not turning back, not needing to, because the shift behind her was already real, already set in motion, and then she stepped out into the hallway, the door closing gently behind her, the sound quiet, but complete, and inside, the room continued, different now, more careful, more aware, while Edward remained where he was for a moment longer, his eyes resting on the closed door, the reflection of it faintly visible in the polished surface of the table, and he exhaled slowly, not with relief, but with understanding, the kind that does not come from winning, but from finally seeing clearly, and in the hallway, Naomi walked forward under the soft overhead lights, her shadow moving beside her, steady and unbroken, as the building around her carried on as it always had, unaware that something within it had shifted in a way that could not be undone, and she continued toward the elevator, not hurried, not delayed, just moving forward, the quiet strength she carried no longer invisible, even if no one spoke it aloud, and as the doors opened for her